Mike Shanzu, Senior Principal Magistrate Joe Omido, also directed that one victim identified as feminist Mona be remanded in custody for declining to quit the deadly cult and will be forced to eat while in custody. The prosecution has indicated that it has no intention of charging the victims, urging them to cooperate with the investigators. Meanwhile, Shakahola death toll has risen to 326 after 8 bodies were exhumed today from the Shakahola forest.
Tonight, disturbing developments out of Kilifi County are reigniting fears that the horror of Shakahola may not be over. Almost 2 years since the horrifying discovery of mass graves in Shakahola forest, there are renewed cases of cult practices after authorities recovered 1 body and rescued 4 emaciated individuals just kilometers from the original Shakahola site. Even more unsettling, among those arrested are a husband and wife who are former victims of the Shakahola cult who vanished from their home in Siaya County and returned to the forest. As you'll hear now from Emily Chebet, a relative claims the man left with 6 children whose whereabouts remain unknown.
In April 2023, Kenyan authorities began investigating reports of mass starvation and cult activity deep in the Shakahola forest. What they found was an apocalyptic cult that had convinced its followers to starve themselves to death in order to meet Jesus. By mid-year, over 400 bodies, many of them children, had been exhumed from shallow graves in the forest. The number kept rising. Some victims had died of starvation, while others showed signs of strangulation, suffocation, or blunt force trauma. Survivors, those found barely clinging to life, told investigators of forced fasting, guarded camps, and violent punishment for those who attempted to escape or eat in secret. To the casual eye, Paul Mackenzie was an unassuming man, a former taxi driver with a soft-spoken demeanor and deep, almost soothing cadence. But beneath that calm voice was a man whose delusions would cost hundreds of lives, transforming the lush, quiet expanse of Shakahola forest into a graveyard of hope. Born in Kenya's East region, Mackenzie grew up in modest circumstances. In his earlier years, he operated a matatu and later transitioned into taxi driver in the bustling town of Malindi. But somewhere along that path, perhaps driven by hardship, power, lust, or the desire for significance, Mackenzie found religion, or more accurate, he weaponized it. In the early 2000s, he found the Good News International Church, a modest ministry that preached heavy doses of end-times prophecy, anti-modern education, and an increasingly paranoid worldview. His theology was a cocktail of fear, manipulation, and radical detachment from reality. He warned his growing congregation that schools were satanic, hospitals were death traps, and the government was the devil's playground. His answer to salvation, isolation, obedience, and ultimately death by starvation. Mackenzie's message grew darker and more fanatical over time. He preached about the end of the world, urging followers to abandon their jobs, sell their property, withdraw their children from school, and retreat into the wilderness to prepare for the coming apocalypse. His apocalyptic timeline was constantly shifting, but the year 2023 became central. He claimed that Jesus would return in April and that only those who had starved themselves to death would enter heaven. But Mackenzie didn't fast. He didn't retreat. He lived comfortably off the tithes, offering and sacrifices of his loyal followers. He owned lands, vehicles, and bank accounts that were later linked to the proceeds of his cult activities. He was, by all means, a manipulator in a prophet's robe, hiding behind the pulpit to orchestrate one of the deadliest religious massacres in modern Africa history. Despite facing multiple arrests between 2017 and 2023 for inciting extremism, radicalizing children, and opposing education, McKenzie was repeatedly released, a failure that would later stain the hands of law enforcement and local government officials. Each time, he came back more radical, more convinced of his divine mission, and more dangerous. When he closed his church in 2019, it wasn't the end, it was only the beginning. Under the guise of private worship, McKenzie moved his operation into the Shakahola forest, remote, wooded, and largely unmonitored. Here he formed camps, enforced rules of silence, and built an iron-fisted cult hierarchy with loyal enforcers to keep people in line. Women, children, entire families entered Shakahola, but few came out alive. He taught that eating was sin, that crying over a loved one was demonic weakness, and that those who tried to live were possessed. It wasn't just religious extremism, it was psychological captivity. McKenzie had become a self-styled messiah of death. By the time authorities intervened in 2023 April, the forest had become a mass grave, and the McKenzie name had become synonymous with death, deception, and divine betrayal. Hundreds of bodies were exhumed, some emaciated from starvation, others showing signs of violence, indicating that the fast wasn't always voluntary. Deep within the dense, sun-scorched thickets of Shakahola Forest in Kilifi County, something sinister unfolded, far from the gaze of neighbors, officials, or even the grieving families who would later come searching. What began as religious retreat quickly turned into a death camp orchestrated by self-proclaimed prophet who claimed to speak to God, but whose gospel was written in blood and silence. Paul Mackenzie, the leader of the Good News International Church, had convinced his followers that the world would end in April 2023. To be saved, he said, they had to fast, not for a day, not for a week, but to death. Only by dying could they meet Jesus. This was symbolic Lent. This was calculated starvation enforced by fear, ritual, and control. By the time authorities arrived in April, tipped off by concerned families and human rights activists, it was already too late for hundreds. The scene they encountered was apocalyptic, emaciated survivors barely clinging to life, shallow graves hidden under trees, fresh mounds of soil. The dead were everywhere, men, women, entire families, and heartbreakingly, children. Some had died willingly. They had been told that suffering was holy, that hunger was a proof of faith. Others had tried to escape but were caught, beaten, and either forced back into the hut or killed for disobedience. Survivors later revealed that Mackenzie had guards, enforcers who patrolled the forest, assured no one ate and buried the dead when they fell. And then came the most harrowing truth. Children were ordered to die fast. Mackenzie's twisted logic was that if parents watched their children perish, they'd be too broken to resist. He preached that children were more pure and should meet Jesus before the others. Infants were starved. Older children were hidden away in huts and left to die. Some victims showed signs of suffocation, strangulations, or blunt force trauma, meaning not everyone died from hunger. Some were silenced when they fought back. Some were killed to make examples. Others died while still hoping that salvation would come even as their bodies shut down. As more graves were exhumed, it became clear this wasn't an isolated group of zealots. It was a structured, militarized doomsday cult. Camps were separated by stage of fasting, those preparing, those actively starving, and nearly death. Some victims were found tied up, others locked in huts with no food, water, or light. In total, over 400 bodies were discovered by mid-2023. That number may continue to rise. And Mackenzie? He was planning to disappear. Survivors say he had instructed his inner circle to fast and die while he withdrew from public life. Having already sold properties and liquidated assets, the plan was to leave no trace but fate, and a handful of desperate parents intervened just in time. When the horrors of Shakahola Forest came to light, it wasn't just a religious scandal, it was a national moral failure. The gruesome discovery of hundreds of bodies starved to death under the orders of a self-proclaimed prophet didn't just ignite mourning, it sparked fury. How could such atrocities unfold for years under the government's watch in broad daylight? The answer lies in a tragic blend of neglect, corruption, and systematic apathy. Long before the first shallow grave was unearthed in April 2023, Paul Mackenzie had already caught the attention of local authorities. He had been arrested multiple times, first in 2017, again in 2019, and later in 2023, on charges ranging from promoting extremist teaching to obstructing children's access to education. But each time, he walked free. Charges were dropped, investigations stalled, and Mackenzie returned to his pulpit more emboldened than before. Red flags were everywhere. He told parents to withdraw their children from school. He preached that hospitals were evil. He sold doomsday's prophecy to poor, desperate followers. Yet no one stopped him, not the police, not the courts, and not the county administration. In fact, local chief and law enforcement officers were accused of being complicit, either through outright corruption or deadly incompetence. Some reports claimed they were bribed to turn a blind eye. Others simply ignored repeated complaints from villagers and whistleblowers who begged for action. By the time national security forces intervened, the forest had already become a mass graveyard. The massacre triggered public outrage across Kenya. Social media exploded with anger. Civil society groups demanded resignation. Grieving families protested outside government offices, holding up photos of their missing loved ones, some still unaccounted for. The press dubbed it a state-enabled slaughter, questioning how a known cult leader could operate a doomsday camp in a protected forest, unchecked for years. President William Ruto called the events in Shakahola terrorism of a different kind, vowing swift justice. A presidential commission of inquiry was formed to investigate the massacre, led by retired officials and legal experts. But even this was met with skepticism. Many saw it as a PR stunt, another report destined for dust. And then came the darker question: how many other Mackenzies are out there? How many unregulated churches operate with zero oversight, preaching death and doom to vulnerable followers? Religious extremism, it seemed, has crept deep in the cracks of a broken system. The massacre exposed a truth that Kenya could no longer ignore. Spiritual manipulation thrives where the state is absent. Where there is poverty, illiteracy, and desperation, the self-declared prophets rise. And unless bold reforms are made, law tightened, oversight enforced, and victims protected, Shakahola may not be the last. The national outcry has not faded. It simmers beneath the surface, fueled by grief and rage. For the families who lost everything, apologies mean nothing without accountability. Because the truth is, Paul Mackenzie didn't act alone. He was enabled by silence, indifference, and a government that failed to protect its people. The discovery of mass graves in Shakahola may have shaken the nation, but for investigators, the journey into the forest marked only the beginning. Behind every corpse unearthed, behind every whisper from survivors, lies a deeper, more chilling question: how deep did this go? As of mid-2025, the investigation into the Shakahola massacre is far from over. What started as a search and rescue mission quickly evolved into a nationwide manhunt for truth, accountability, and hidden collaborators. Hundreds of bodies have been exhumed, but many more people remain missing, their fates unknown. The government has confirmed that dozens of shallow graves are still being discovered, with forensic team working round the clock, exhuming, identifying, and documenting evidence. Inside makeshift command centers on the edge of the forest, pathologists, anthropologists, and forensic scientists continue to sort through the remains, many of them reduced to bones, with DNA samples being matched to families who reported their loved ones missing. Each new ID adds a name to the death toll and a story to the silence. Meanwhile, Paul Mackenzie remains in custody, along with over 30 of his inner circle, including alleged lieutenants who acted as enforcers in the forest camps. Mackenzie had denied all wrongdoing, claiming that his followers acted of their own free will. But survivors' testimonies tell a different story, one of coercion, manipulation, and deadly control. Witnesses have described a cult structure that was highly organized with ranks, assigned roles, and coded language. Some say Mackenzie did not work alone, that his influence extended beyond his cult into local authorities, landowners, and even some religious networks. These leads have prompted investigators to dig deep, exploring whether there were financial transactions, land deals, or protection rackets connected to his church operation. The Presidential Commission of Inquiry, formed in May 2023, has been holding hearings in Nairobi and Kilifi, calling survivors, law enforcement, and local administrators to testify. The testimonies have been harrowing. Stories of children buried alive or guards who beat escapees into unconsciousness. What am I even reading? Stories of children buried alive, of guards who beat escapees into unconsciousness, of families who watched each other waste away one by one. Several police officers and Kilifi County officials are under investigation for negligence or collusion. Several police officers and Kilifi County officials are under investigation for negligence or collusion, with some already suspended pending further review. There is also growing concern that Shakahola was not isolated. Intelligence reports suggest that Mackenzie teaching may have spread to other regions, and that splinter cells or hidden sects could still be operational, lying low in remote villages across Kenya. The government has begun a crackdown on unregistered churches, placing rogue religious groups under surveillance, but for many, these efforts came too late. Activists are now calling for national registry of religious organizations, mental health support for survivors, and reparations for the families affected. Behind the shocking headlines lie the faces and names of real people. Children whose lives were cut short, parents who watched their loved ones die, and entire communities shattered by religious extremists. The Shakahola massacre is not just a tale of cult madness. It's a haunting warning about failed system, blind faith, and how charisma, when unchecked, can become a deadly weapon.